Hi everyone. I decided to do a small project on clouds for my watercolour class, and I also decided it might make a helpful video for YouTube. Clouds can be quite problematic to paint in watercolour, as I'm sure some of you know, and I'm hoping that in this process I'll get to the bottom of some of those problems. Obviously there are lots of different cloud types and sky scenarios. I'm only going to be dealing with one in this video. That's going to be blue sky with backlit clouds. But a lot of the problems we encounter along the way when you're painting clouds should be fairly universal to what I'm covering in this video. So hopefully you'll find it helpful, and if you do, please like and subscribe. So this is a double page spread from one of my sketchbooks. I always like to start a project by doing some drawing, and I like to use watercolour pencils. So these are Caran d'Ache watercolour pencils that I've worked with on these drawings. And they're from photographs I took from my studio window. So it's quite a familiar scene. I wouldn't call it exactly choice for a painting, but for cloud studies you often get good cloudscapes from this window, and I chose to depict 4 different sorts. So this is actually the view, although it's rainy at the moment, and there aren't any clouds other than thick cloud. I started off with this very quick study, just quickly getting the sky in, and then working with different greys for the dark areas of the backlit clouds. And this little exercise was done fairly quickly without any special techniques, just to try and find some of the typical problems that people come up with. And it's very easy to happen upon those problems, like hard edges, as you see here. I wiped out some of the wet paint, but it's still stained. The paper is still stained. It's not as white as it would be. There are various hard edges and backgrounds, overlays, all kinds of ugly little problems like this splot here. So there are all kinds of things that I really don't like the look of. There's also quite a bit of granulation in the blue. So the next problem was to find what best blue to use for this project. So I tried all my different blues on quite a few different types of paper, and I did some sponging out with some tissue just to see how each one responds. And you can see that there are different levels of granulation and different types of paint behave differently. Some stain the paper, so they're harder to lift. Some papers are more easily stained. So it's a good idea to do these tests. Achieving a nice flat wash or a nicely gradated wash for your blue sky can be quite difficult, and I urge people to practice that. It's important to mix up enough paint, and it's important to also have everything ready and use a large enough brush to cover the area. I think it's really nice to leave the whitest whites using just the white of the paper. It's the best way of achieving a bright white, I think. It's much better than adding body colour later. It seems to achieve a greater brilliance, as you can see in this example here. So there's, in the background you've got wiped out clouds and then the backlit clouds. This is another example, a different type of cloud, and it's not so much backlit. Then these are more slightly backlit, but you can see them receding into the background. And I'm using various different techniques that I'm discovering along the way, but you can see various mistakes. I mean, I've overworked the cloud in this one, the sky, I've overworked it. And it's just a nice little sheet of experiments that helped me develop my skills as I've gone along the way. This one went okay, but again, I didn't leave enough white, so I've actually used white ink. This one was more successful. This is the one that's in the demonstration actually, but I do work on it a bit further than it is at this stage. So you can see there are various different techniques going on, and to the left of it, as you'll see in a moment as we pan across, yet another version of the same painting, but without such a fiddly blue area in the sky. There are some softer areas as well in the shading in the clouds. So without further ado, we'll begin the demonstration now. I started off camera just drawing in some light lines as guidelines so that I know where to go. And as you can see on the right, I've mixed up a great big pool of paint. There's quite a lot of paint in there, just enough for me to do what I need to do. And I'm using a reasonable sized mop brush, and I want to keep the edge of this wet. I want to keep as much of it wet as I can whilst I'm working on it. That way I'll get an even amount of paint all over. I can then gradate it if I want by adding more paint at the top. So I'm just being careful to keep those edges wet and not allow any of the edges to dry hard until they meet the edge of the cloud. And I can draw in around the cloud. As you can see in my left hand, I've got a much finer brush. That finer brush will be used to draw in some of the finer details around the cloud. So you can see now I'm beginning to do that. I'm keeping to my outline and just shaping those edges. Now, because I'm filming, the board is flat, but ideally I would lift it up and swish paint around. So by moving the board around, I can direct the pools of paint to help make a more gradated sky if I wanted to. But at the moment, I'm just pushing around pools of paint. I'm not really doing too much brushing into the page as pushing around pools of paint that seem to float on top of the surface of the paper. You've got to work quite quick because it is drying all the time, and even though there's a certain amount of time to work, there's a lot of edges, and because I want those edges to be reasonably crisp, not completely hard everywhere, I've got to work fast. I can soften some of them before it thoroughly dries, but on the initial wash-in, it's important to nail those edges, get everything dialed in where you want it. A lot of demonstrations show lifting out clouds from a blue sky, and this is the sort of time you can do it when the sky is still wet. You need a very clean tissue to do that. It can be very effective, and I'm by no means criticising that method. I just wanted to have a whiter sky. Whenever I've done lift outs, I find it's rare to get the whiteness unless you add a little bit of water and then mop it out. This gives me a little bit more control, and it's a bit less random because I'm working to a reference photograph, from a reference photograph, and I'm actually using the paint rather than accidental work with tissues. You can be fairly accurate with tissues, but you can't really always get it to go where you want. So I thought I would experiment with this rather than rely on lifting out as a technique. I quite like having the control. This blue is a phthalo blue with a little bit of manganese blue mixed in. The manganese tends to granulate a little bit, so I didn't put much of the manganese into this mix. Now I've got the main area of blue in, there are just a few other areas, very small areas, where blue is peeping through the cloud. It's not that noticeable once the rest of the cloud is painted in, but it's there, and I just wanted to see how it will work if I can overcome that, get it in. So you can see I've used a lot of my blue up now, but there's still enough left, so I don't have to mix any more right now, which is very useful. That's why it's a good idea to mix plenty up, because you will need a fair amount. If I'd wanted it more dilute and a bit paler, obviously I could have mixed more water into it, but I still would have mixed a fair amount and taken my time to mix it all in so there's no lumps and bumps or any small pieces, fragments of paint. This is not really going to be a painting, it's more just a study of clouds and the cloud type. I'm not that worried about composition, it's just a study from a photograph. So here I am going to just use a little bit of the blotting out technique using a piece of clean kitchen roll. It's clean and it's dry. You can see that lifting this particular colour is not lifting it completely back to the white of the paper. If you look at the difference between what I've just lifted and what I left white, you can see it's quite noticeable. If I wanted to achieve more white this way, I'd need to add some water with a brush. I'd just put some water where I want the wipeout to be, push it around to the shape I wanted it to be, and then soak up with the tissue. But this particular method that you're seeing at the moment is good for those little skimpy background clouds that you sometimes get, and they were definitely present in this scene. Obviously there are lots of different types of paper. There are lots of different types of paint as well, and there's student grade and there's artist professional grade, all different kinds. They all behave slightly differently. So if you work in one particular way using one particular type of paint, you might settle down to paint some clouds of a certain type and find it much more difficult than you might find another set of clouds. A lot of people seem to have problems with clouds. I've encountered quite a lot of problems in this process, and I think materials and being familiar with your materials illustrates how difficult this can be. It's becoming familiar with what you have. I've tried it on different textured paper as well, so smooth paper and on quite textured paper, and there are some differences. I think that a knot paper, which is a medium textured paper, which I prefer, seems to give the most satisfactory results for me anyway, and that's what I'm using here. So I've just dampened a brush by wetting it with clean water and then soaking a lot of the water out of it. There's still some water in it, and with that I can soften the edges of the clouds where I need to. I have a piece of kitchen roll in my left hand, and I can adjust the level of dampness of the brush with that kitchen roll periodically. So I've wet it slightly more now, and I can lift some more of the blue away just to create some contrails or more clouds behind. Just lightly skimming the surface. It's not thoroughly dry yet. If it were dry I could still do that, but I would need to wet it and then lift it and then soften edges. I just refer to this little practice piece just to give me a little idea of what I did before, and I take a fairly dilute mixture of Payne's grey with a little bit of ultramarine, dab my brush, decide where I'm going to go, where I'm going to start, and I think I'll start top left and start with a fairly medium wash just into a very small area, leaving the edge of the cloud light, which is what makes it look very much like a backlit cloud. Now I've added that paint, and then I use a dry brush. This brush is completely dry now. It's been cleaned and then dried with a tissue, so there's really no moisture left in it. And using that, I can soften the wash that I've just put down without adding any more water, which is a really useful technique. It's very good for softening edges, and it behaves a little bit differently from a damp brush. So with a dry brush I can push things around that are already damp without adding water. You have to remember which brush in your hand is the one that is dry and which has got paint on, otherwise you may find that you come a cropper. So I'm keeping the area wet so I don't get any hard edges. Adding as much paint as I need. The less I touch it, the better, I find. If you keep overworking bits, especially while they're wet, you'll be constantly lifting and adjusting the water situation, and once you've done that, you get a great deal of unevenness, which I find particularly ugly. I think it's one of the problems with watercolour as opposed to the body colours such as gouache, acrylic and oil, where you can blend and mix and overpaint with more ease than you can with watercolour. With watercolour, we really rely on that white of the paper. You can use white paints and you can use white ink and you can use various other things, but it seldom looks as brilliantly white as the white of the paper. You can also use masking fluid. I haven't used any on this particular project. Now I'm just preparing an area and using the damp brush and then the dry brush to soften edges. Just making sure that I'm preparing that area for a little bit more paint to go in. It's just a question of really looking at the reference, trying to keep those white edges fairly thin and keep the shaded cloud, which I'm painting in the dark paint, close to that edge and neatly as possible. So you can see there that I've accidentally lifted a little piece of the dark I've just put in, and I don't want to get any tide marks, so I'm just being a little bit careful around that. Working like this, I find you need to really plan ahead. You need to be certain of what you want to achieve, because changing the mood or atmosphere or even the tone a great deal later isn't that easy, and to a certain extent you may just have to repaint the whole thing again. And I've done quite a lot of variations on this particular theme now, and the more I do it, the more I seem to learn, but I'm not sure I'm 100% satisfied with any of them. But that's just me being quite critical, and I think part of the problem is that the reference itself is just a view out of the window, and this is just a study, so I really shouldn't be beating myself up too much. It's not trying to be a painting, it's just a study, and a study of the techniques necessary to achieve some of these effects. This particular cloud has quite a lot of darkness, especially at the bottom, which gradates upwards into a slightly warmer, lighter area. So you can see on the right of the cloud where it's fragmented, that nice backlit effect becomes really quite strong with the white of the paper, and I think that's quite effective. I found that using the dry brush, this particular dry brush has got a few stray hairs, so it's not that great, but I've used various over the whole project, and using the dry brush has been fairly game changing in some ways, because I've often used just a damp brush, but also having a dry one means that you can spread paint around and use it for softening edges that are just damp, and it does largely avoids creating little tide marks. So that's well worth trying using a dry brush. I haven't come across anyone else who actually says that they use a dry brush. There are various people using damp brushes, and I do that too, but I found using an actual dry one, and using different sized dry ones too, really useful for spreading paint around and blending. Now I'm working in a similar way, but because light is spilling onto this left hand side of the central cloud, the shadow areas are much lighter, and I'm keeping them fairly light, so even when I put paint on and it seems a little darker, by using the dry brush I can mop some of the paint out of it, and yet it still leaves a very small, very fine stain. It's a tone we can see. It's not as white as the white of the page, and that's desirable, especially when you want to gradate an area. So even these little patches I'm putting on now, I can lighten by using the dry brush, or I can darken by adding a bit more pigment. But I want to spread this across the cloud, as you can see now. So even with a small brush like this, it's got very long hair and it holds a reasonable amount of paint, so I can use the side of this brush if I want to spread some paint around. It's a very good brush. When I bought it, I didn't think it would be very good. I just bought it because it was very cheap, but it's actually really good. It's very fine for drawing. So in there with the dry brush again, just softening that lower edge, and you can see how you can gradate it and spread it out. Then going in again with a little bit more paint, just tentatively at first until I decide where I'm going. It's all supposedly representing light filtering through the cloud from behind, all these lighter areas. And you can develop this with a little more subtlety as you go along. This is quite a small painting actually. I mean it's only it's a bit smaller than A4, and size really does matter, folks. If you want to get more detail in, you probably need to go larger and plan it even more. But because this is just a small study, I've kept it to a reasonably manageable size, and I will add a small piece of landscape at the bottom just to ground things off and anchor the sky to something and make it hopefully have a little bit more sense. As I said earlier, it's the scene from my studio window, and I look at it quite often. You do get some pretty amazing sunsets here, especially in October, November, with low sun setting in the west. So again, I'm building this up, just taking my time. This is real time, so you can see how long it's taking. But what's the hurry? Just take your time, build it up gradually, keep looking at the reference. No hurry means that you just are less likely to mess things up. And it's more enjoyable to have that control. So again, leaving the edge white, you can see how I can build that up, and I can darken it and blend that darkness into lighter areas as well, using my damp brush or my dry brush. So with some of the earlier attempts, I was trying to mix some browns in with some of the blues to mix greys, but I found that some of them were causing granulation too much when they mixed on the page, and it was really looking quite crude and harsh in my opinion. And I think a light touch is what you need with clouds. I think even in the darks it's got to be touched as little as possible to keep it clean. The more you brush it, the more you work it, the more problems you create on the surface. So quite a light wash in those small areas there. There's more light on this side of the cloud, and now with the still damp brush from the wash, I'm able to soften the edge of the cloud. So the main blue area is still not fully hardened or cured, enabling me to still soften it more easily than it would be had I let it cure. Just gradually building things up as I go. Now, some of these clips look like they're sped up, but they're actually not. This is all real time. I haven't sped any of the film up at all. I think it's really useful to see how it works in real time rather than time-lapse. I've done a lot of time-lapse films and they're okay. They do get to the point very quickly, but I think it's quite nice to see things done in actual time, especially with awkward subjects like clouds. People want to really see what's going on and how you overcome some of these problems. I guess if you're used to painting, you assume people know what you're doing, but it's very difficult to always tell what's happening when you're watching a video. If it's just silent, you don't know whether the piece of paper is wet or dry, or whether somebody's wet their brush, or whether it's a dry brush. It's very difficult to know what's going on. I'm using a wet brush now that's been dried to not quite damp, it's just still wet enough to drop water onto the edge, and I'm working that edge with the same brush whilst it's wet. I can do the same up there and carry on lifting using my clean tissue. So even when it's fully dry and cured, say a week later, I can come back and still do that. You can also wash over various areas once they're dry. You just have to be careful with how long you leave water on there so it doesn't reactivate the paint that you've already put down, unless you're trying to lift, of course. But as I've said before, you can see how stained the paper is, and once it gets to a certain amount of cured time, you can't really take away that stain back to the white. That only really happens before it's dry. It happens in the early stages. This is why I think it's so important to leave the white or mask it out if you want it to be very bright. Obviously, perspective affects clouds. So when you've got a large cloud in the foreground, a cloud of similar size further back will obviously be smaller, and so on. You can always tell, your eye knows when something's closer or further away. Now that's easy to identify when you've got regular sized clouds all at the same height, but occasionally you'll get different shaped clouds, you'll get a different type of cloud, maybe a damp misty cloud, or maybe a cloud in shadow. Sometimes these can look visually confusing, and it's probably best to avoid those if you can. Choose your reference carefully, and if you want them to use them in a painting, I think you really need to be very careful, and you need to decide whether you want the clouds to be the hero of the piece, whether it's all about a cloud painting, or whether they're just part of the background. If they're part of the background, they can still be dramatic depending on the lighting conditions, but you really want to consider how much a part are they playing. Will they detract from the centre of focus? So bear all that in mind. So now I'm painting some of the more distant clouds in a similar way. They've still got light coming through them, and they've still got darker areas. It's just much smaller at the back, right in the distance, in the receding landscape. So just taking my time to get some of those in. Now if it was a larger paper, larger piece of paper, larger painting, I could spend more time on these and they'd be probably more accurate and more detailed. But this is pretty small, the area I'm working on, and I've got to be fairly careful. But it is just an impressionistic study, as I've said. I'm not overly worried about composition here. A lot of people's cloud studies on YouTube seem to be just cloud studies rather than including landscapes or about a painting. But if you look at clouds and go and look at paintings of clouds or paintings that include clouds, it will help you to see how other painters have tackled these problems. It's worth looking at oil paintings, it's worth looking at acrylics and gouache paintings as well, and even pencil drawings, to see the kind of dynamism and composition and light and what clouds are used for in painting, or how they're portrayed. And there have been some fairly notable cloud painters, and there are one or two people who specialise in painting clouds today, and you can find them if you take your time to look online. And I urge you to do that if you're interested in painting clouds, because whilst there's a certain randomness about clouds, they still conform to physics, they still conform to gravity, subject to light, and are subject to other weather conditions such as wind. And the light that falls on the landscape also has to look pretty much in harmony with the light that's in the sky. We know if it looks weird, and occasionally you do see a weird sky when you look out onto the landscape, and it can be dramatic or it can just be quite strange. And I remember seeing a very strange pink sky over Sidmouth, over the sea once, and being quite shocked by it. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. It was just a pale pink, and it was just all over the whole sky, and I'd never seen it before, and I've never seen it since. And I remember being quite gobsmacked by it, because it was quite unusual. You see pink parts of skies sometimes, but to see a whole sky pink with a fairly green looking sea was fairly outlandish. And if you painted that, you might find it hard to believe, but it was fairly hard to believe. Choosing your subject matter so that it is believable is very important. If you choose a photograph or a landscape that really isn't that good, particularly with photographs, if you choose a photograph that's not good, your painting's not going to be good unless you're a genius at altering things and just using it as a kind of starting point, which is okay, but tends to take quite a bit of experience to get the hang of, and it doesn't always work out. You've got to know a lot about weather conditions, you've got to know a lot about how things work. A good deal of observation goes into putting artistic license into things if you want it to be believable. So I'm just working a little bit on the foreground now. The field at the moment outside is actually green, but at the time I was taking the photographs, it had recently been harvested, and the soil here in Devon is quite red, and I'm just suggesting this with some reds and reddish brown colours, laying in the first couple of washes, and you can see already that it begins to ground the landscape and make a little bit more sense of the clouds rather than just being clouds, because there's a hill and a brow of a hill that I'm looking towards. The recession of the clouds isn't so apparent in this particular view. There's one or two telegraph poles or electrical poles in the field as well, one of which has been struck by lightning a couple of times, and that's what I'm painting in now. Now I've mixed up quite a dark green with a little bit of brown in it. This is for the first tree on the left, which will just be an impression of it. I'm not going to make it too detailed at this size. As long as I get the shape of it, the general shape and some of the outline, there's not a lot of white on it. Making sure to leave enough light coming through the foliage, and then I can go back in and make it more detailed or cut some of that out and make it darker again if I need to, but I can't really take it out very easily, especially with this dark paint. So I'm making sure I'm leaving a certain amount of white showing through. And I've just sped up this little section of film in which I paint the trees, because it's not necessarily about painting trees, this video, but I know some of you would probably ask to see the process if I didn't include it, so I'm just adding it but speeding it up. I think you get the gist from what I've included. I'm just going in and darkening the field a little bit more, making it a bit redder, a bit more punchy colour, a bit more dark in the foreground. I'm revisiting the cloud again and carrying on with a similar technique as before, just varying the tone a little. So some of these light areas showing through the cloud can be darkened, and I do darken them up a bit later. I ran out of space on my iPad for all the footage, so the actual technique isn't a great deal different from what I've already shown, but I will show the final painting once I've made a few more adjustments later on. Since this painting, I've done two other iterations. One of them appears at the end next to this painting, and it's a slightly more subtle version, not so bright all over the place. And then the final version is even more subtle than that, with a paler sky and quite delicately painted clouds, but it doesn't show up so well. I did record it all and was thinking about replacing this piece of footage with all that to show some really delicate, sensitive bits of painting. But as I said, the iPad's run out of space, so until I upload this film, really that's not an option. And I'm not sure it really shows off any better than this, the techniques that I've been demonstrating. This is just a demonstration piece after all, and I've tried to make videos of various different iterations, and I think this has been the most graphically illustrative example, so I've stuck with this one. And at the end you'll see all the pictures that I've made for this project. They're not all good. Some of them I think have been rather disastrous, and I think it's good for you to see that, because you don't often see the mistakes, the warts and all, and there are plenty, especially with experimentational watercolours. It's often the case that there are quite a few trashed pieces of paper and paintings that just didn't work out, or that I didn't like for whatever reason. I think that's part of the process, and I treat it as practice. I don't necessarily think of it as time lost. I think of it as experience gained, and if you can adopt that way of thinking, it's less disappointing if you spent a few hours on something and then you throw it away, or you put it aside and it just becomes part of the pile that will never be seen other than maybe for a tutorial such as this. So can't stop fiddling and just working on these little clouds in the sky again and trying to lift a little bit more out, but you can see how hard it is once it's set to get back to that white. There's a fair bit of water going on there, and you can gradually make it a little bit lighter by dabbing and wetting and dabbing, but you've got to be careful that you don't damage the surface of the paper, and some of the cheaper papers just break down too quickly. This I think is Bockingford 300 GSM knot surface. It's quite durable, but even this will only take so much hammering, so you've got to be a little bit careful. And now I'm starting to just readjust some of the lighter areas, tone them down slightly with just a faint wash. Now if you wash over dark areas, you've got to be a little bit careful. A, not to lift any paint that's already there, so make sure it's dry already, and B, so that you don't get tide marks or hard edges forming that really start to destroy the image, the illusion of what you're trying to create. One way of overcoming this is to wet the whole area first, obviously leaving the whites, but you've got to do it very carefully or else edges form. I've actually missed a little bit to the top of this patch, and there's a little bit of an edge forming, but I can go back in and soften that later with a moist brush and the dry brush, and that tends to work. And another way, another technique, if you get little tide marks appearing on the edge of a wash, sometimes you can really mop them up with a piece of dry tissue to remove them. So this is the end of the filmed part of the demonstration, and I think it's still quite crude in places and needs a fair bit of refinement, which I have already explained I did off camera later. Here's another one that I did just after I'd completed that. It's a little more refined, but there are still issues with it, and I think it's going to be the way for quite a while because I just don't feel happy. This one I'd actually did earlier, and I think it's possibly one of the better ones, and this is another one. And this is yet another one with quite a pale sky and a little bit more subtlety, but still probably largely unresolved. So as promised, here's a quick look at some of the good, the bad and the ugly. Different attempts, different stages, different paint, different paper. Some quick, some not as quick. Some of the ones you've already seen. And there we go. Quite a few there. Some also went in the bin that were just very quick and very messy. And I think one of the things that one can conclude from this is the reference needs to be good. You need to plan things carefully. If you want to make an actual painting, you need to think about the composition, and you need to take your time and try and get it right. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and please like and subscribe, make comments, and I'll answer them if I can.